Letters from a Lost Uncle by Mervyn Peake. Part 3. Letter number 13. It couldn't have been more than 11 o'clock when Jay and I continued our way across the black ice. The whole adventure of the whirlwind had only taken about half an hour. But now, a sepia-coloured darkness began to close around me, and the feeling that I was entering dangerous country grew strong again. It was getting time for our dinner, but somehow it is pleasanter to eat among rocks or icebergs or even glaciers which one can lean against than sitting exposed and alone in the middle of an ice field with nothing else for miles. One feels so conspicuous, especially when Jackson makes such noises when he is feeding and covers his chin with gravy meal after meal. So we walked on until we reached the base of a glacier. To our surprise, we found a circle of frozen rocks, and in the middle was the owner of the desolate place. The hairiest and whitest polar bear that I have ever seen. I did not know that they were ever as huge as this one. His paws were enormous, with every toenail like a carving knife. But his eyes seemed very small and evil in his shaggy head, like loganberries. We had no time to go back. He had seen us. With a growl that made Jackson turn a most beastly colour, he stood up on his back legs. Then he roared, and the rocks trembled, and blocks of ice crashed and tinkled as they fell from the glacier above, and hundreds of echoes roared after him and got fainter and fainter. Jackson was shaken like a flag, and I was wondering what I could do to save our lives. I'd left my harpoon behind the door of the cave, which was a very silly thing to do. And it wouldn't have been much use against so huge a beast. Nor could my leg spike jab him any higher than his knee. I knew the way that bears killed people. They take 'em in their huge, white, hairy arms, as though they are going to kiss him, and then they hug him to death. Yeah, I knew it was no good to turn round and run, because with my leg spike, I wouldn't be fast enough to escape. So I waited and hoped for inspiration. The bear waddled up to me and opened his mouth, so that I saw regions of wet crimson which I do not like remembering. I stared up at his big white face and his evil little loganberry eyes. I even took a step closer, although I hadn't decided what to do. Suddenly, his huge arms swept out on either side, embraced me, and lifted me far from the ground, and hugged me to his chest. His hairs, which were like those at the end of a dressing-gown cord, smothered my face. I knew that within a moment he would squeeze the breath out of me. But my arms were around him too, or halfway around at any rate, and I suddenly began to tickle him under his arms. I expected the squeeze to come at any moment, but before he had time to recover from his surprise, I tickled him again, deeper and fiercer than before, and a shudder ran all over him under his hide. Perhaps I imagined it, but I think that his arms did not hold me quite so tight as he shuddered. But I could not escape, of course. I summoned up all the strength I had, for tickling a polar bear becomes tiring, and straining every muscle of my fingers I tickled him again. I've never tickled anything before. As I tickled, the shudder grew more and more violent until it turned into a wriggle. He wriggled all over, his head high up in the air and his eyes tightly shut. But I did not weaken. My fingers worked until their bones ached. And suddenly, a huge convulsion. I heard a shrill, Harry scream of laughter above my head. Then came the uncontrollable wriggles again. Another gigantic scream as the laughter came bursting out of the bear's body until his arms grew so weak that he let me fall to the ground, and his legs grew so weak that he flopped down beside me, and rolling over on his back, he roared and screamed so terribly in his convulsions that I thought it the right time for us to escape. So Jackson and I left him there in the middle of his great hollow home of ice, his paws beating the ground weakly at his side, and his enormous body heaving as his laughter grew and was all mixed up with the echoes which it made. And still we hadn't had dinner, and it was not until we had put at least a dozen glaciers between ourselves and the polar bear that we lit a fire and prepared our meal. It was past tea time when Jay and I came to that weird and crystal region where everything I had longed for happened. Everything I had searched the world for. And yet how different it all was to what I had expected. And rather sad, too. Not that Jay realized this. Bash my blubber. How irritating he is when there's tragedy in the air. He never notices it. But the air was thick with it. And with magic. And danger. I noticed Jay sniffing the breeze, and he began to walk much closer to me than usual. We were in a land of jaggedness. Ahead and on every side, great glittering steeples of ice began to show above the horizon, just as though we were approaching a city of glass churches. We left behind us the snow-covered slopes that were littered with the skulls of bears and the jawbones of whales. Oh, this is the skull of a polar panther, probably the only one. Yeah, he kept it for some time, but it got too heavy. And we're on the snowless, featureless plains of ice again. It was dull and smooth, like stone. But as we proceeded, it became clearer and clearer, and brighter, until we were astonished. All around us was radiance, as though somebody had switched on the electric light. No, not above us, as you would expect. Not the light of the sky, which was inky blue. I mean, below us, under the ice we trod upon. It had become green, like an unripe apple, and transparent. So transparent that I blinked and fidgeted with my eider down. The underneath side of Jackson's face was all lit up with it. For it seemed that we were walking in the middle of the air. For just beneath us were 3 fish with teeth like tombstones. And there was a shark with its ghastly white stomach. And an octopus that was gobbling up something and had purple blotches and eyes like soup plates. When Jay saw these dreadful things just below our feet, he climbed under my eider-down, where he shuddered and made frightened noises. Oh, some puffins were watching us all the time, which became rather embarrassing. I had to carry him for quite a long time before I could get him to his feet again. He was not easy to carry with all our belongings nailed to his back. He couldn't understand that the terrible sea creatures could not reach us through the clear green ice, although they looked as though they could. At last, I set him on his feet again, and we continued on our way over the ice that shone, now here, now there, with scarlet, yellow, and silver lights, as the monsters of the deep rose from the apple-green depths and burned like torches through a window pane. Of all the glass churches with their glittering spikes, there was only one which was loftier and vaster by far than all the others. It seemed silly to direct our feet in any other direction. When we were quite near, we found that there was an island of snow on the ice near the body of the great glass church. In the middle of the white island, the soft snow was heaved up in a long hump, not at all like an ordinary hill, but a much more exciting shape. I didn't know then why I thought it looked exciting, but I know that I thought it would be good to get to the top of it and admire the view all round before we explored the crystal spires of the shining cathedral that shone above. Within a few minutes, we were wading knee-deep in the snowy island, with its white reflection in the green ice. Before we reached the white hummocky shape in the rubble, I began to feel queer indeed. All sorts of memories rushed into my mind. I thought of tropical lands, of rivers that steamed in the African sun, and of the yellow floods of water that try to swallow China. I thought of all kinds of things suddenly as I stood there, and especially of the white lion, whose haunting presence in my mind had changed my life and made me one of the greatest explorers that the world has never known. And every time I thought of the white lion, my heart began to knock like a bandit's gong. I had never felt quite like this before, and I wondered why it should happen now. I looked this way and that way, but I could see nothing to make me feel so funny. Perhaps an earthquake is going to start, I thought, or a volcano, or even an avalanche. But the air was deadly silent. Not a thing moved. I listened again with my head on one side, and then with my ear to the snow, which is the best way. But I couldn't hear anything. Jackson was wrinkling his nose and frowning and looking very silly. I pulled myself together, gave Jackson a sharp word of command, and we started to climb the hummocky mound that seemed to shine even more whitely than anything else in the whole landscape. The snow got shallower at once and was only just over our ankles. And a few minutes later, not even our boots were covered. I had put the cork on the end of my leg spike when we arrived at the island of snow, but it seemed to slip more than usual, and so did my ordinary foot as I climbed. When we reached the top, we stared around us, and still could see no reason for the excitement which both of us felt more than ever. For even Jackson could not keep still for a minute, but kept sniffing at the white ground we were standing on, and muttering to himself. Somehow the danger and magic which I felt in my body was stronger than ever up there on the mound. We sat down, and for the first time that day felt warm. We even took our gloves off, for the snow itself seemed to give out heat, which was very peculiar indeed. I took off my bowler hat and scratched my head. Then I put my hat on again. Next, I looked down at the soft snow island beneath us, some distance below, and I felt a great desire to get down there as quickly as I could, although I could not think why. Pickle my blubber and twang my gullet strings, but it was most odd indeed, and my spine was in a turmoil of shudders. To calm myself, I took out my pipe, and finding a hole in my eiderdown, pulled out a handful of orchid tobacco and began to smoke. And then there was another shudder. But it wasn't mine, and it wasn't Jackson's. The shudder was beneath us. Beneath us. It came out of the warm, hummocky white hill. I shouted to Jackson, "It's an earthquake! Tie up your laces!" For I knew how he was always tripping up, even without earthquakes. But directly I had shouted this, I knew I must be wrong, because no earthquake would take up such a little space as just the hill we were on, but would spread for hundreds of miles. And I knew that the glass mountain, with all the icy steeples, hadn't felt it, for not an icicle tinkled. It was as deadly silent as ever. We had jumped to our feet, of course, and now I was determined to get down to the level snow as fast as I could. Jackson, who seemed to have some kind of instinct which he had never used before, was halfway down the steep white slope already, with the typewriter, saucepans, portmanteaus, and so on, swinging and clanging on his back. I turned to follow him, but my cork foot lost its grip, and before I knew where I was, I found myself tumbling head over heels all the way down the high soft flank of the hill. But before I reached the flat snow at the bottom, the hill itself that I was tumbling down shuddered once more and began to get up. When I had finished falling, I was in the deep snow again, and only my head was above the surface. I was turned the wrong way, and found myself looking at Jackson, who seemed to be smiling behind his hand. But this couldn't have been so, because he had never used any expressions before, except when the bear picked me up weeks ago, when I thought I saw the same sort of smirk on his face. But that was his nervousness too, I expect. Or else colic. I twisted my head so that I could see over my left shoulder. And there against the sky, with his mane billowing out in a cloud of white smoke, and his eyes like platters of gold fire, was the white lion. I've tried to remember and write down what I felt when I saw him, but nothing has come out right. Anyway, you want to know what happened next and not what I felt. So perhaps it is a good thing I can't express my terrible pride when I saw him face to face for the first time. Not that he saw my face. I was too far below him, and he was nearly blind. I could see this at once. His huge gold eyes were quite empty looking, for he was past his prime and was ready to die. But the shaggy and dazzling whiteness of his Arctic fur was something I shall never forget. Even the snow looks dirty and grey to me when I remember the white lion. I had forgotten about Jackson, and was very annoyed when, after looking everywhere for him, I found that he had hidden himself under my eider down. It only shows how much my thoughts were concentrated on the white lion when you realize that I had never even felt him, although he must have wriggled. When I had plucked him out, his teeth were still chattering, and I could not convince him for a long time that the white lion was nearly blind. Just then, the sun began to sink, and there were coloured crosses and circles in the sky. The Hairy Blurialis, or something like that, they call it. And I was very struck with it when I first saw it, with all the sky lit up like fireworks. Anyway, as soon as the sun sank, the white lion shook his mane, and half the sky was hidden with it as it swung to and fro. And then he bridled up his noble head and began to pace to the Cathedral of Glass with its 20,000 spires. In spite of his blindness, he never made a faulty step, but trod on in the deep snow until the ice began, and then on and on over the ice, while I followed him on tiptoe, with Jackson at my heels. The white lion turned to the east when he reached the foot of the cathedral, and padded towards a high, narrow opening with icicles hanging from its roof. When he reached this entrance, he stopped and lowered his head to the ice. Then he coughed out a little rumbling roar, the smallest he could make, and this little roar ran like a boulder over the glass and into the interior, where I heard it leap and toss itself about with 100,000 echoes. It was a kind of warning, like someone makes when they want some more cake at tea time. But who could the white lion be wanting to warn? I could not think. But there he was, his mouth near the green and shining ice, and his forehead wrinkled like a pillow in the early morning as though he was listening. Then he moved like a white and soundless cloud through the opening in the glassy walls. We followed on tiptoe. For a long time it was very dark and colder than I could believe. And then, gradually, the walls grew further apart, and the darkness became green, and the green became lighter and brighter, until suddenly we were in a vast hall, but huger than a hall, more like a theatre, or the inside of a cathedral, as I've called it before. As it was when Jackson and I first saw the fishes under the sea, so it was now. The light shone from below, for the ice at our feet was transparent again, and all along the length of the cathedral floor, as clear as though there was no ice at all, lay a whale as long as a street. It was quite motionless except for its fins, which twitched every now and then to scare away the little crimson fishes that darted here and there. On the ice, a few yards above the whale's head, and far away on the cathedral floor, was a rough and dusky throne of ice, and as the white lion paced his way to it, he held his head very high, although he was so tired after so long and fabulous a life. On every side were glassy terraces. The mountain, which I had thought was made of solid ice, was quite hollow, and far above me the green dusk reached right up to the welkin and filled the empty pinnacles with its colour. But the great whale that brooded beneath the floor was not the only living creature who was watching the lion as he neared the icy throne. Oh, no. I saw a vast and silent congregation, for sitting on the terraces of crystal that rose on every side were arctic beasts and polar fowl, bears, wolves and elks, seals, reindeer and white crows, snow serpents, and every kind of polar creature. And the water beneath the ice was thickening with fish until it was no longer green, but trembled with all the colours of the rainbow. But although everything else reflected the colours that smouldered through the ice, the lion didn't. Nothing could change his whiteness. He was apart from everything else. When he reached the top of the throne, his eyes burned, and he shook his mane for the last time, and as it tossed in a tempest a white string, it hissed in the cathedral silence like 100 snakes. And then it happened. He reared up on his hind legs, opened his great jaws, spread his paws as big as white hassocks against the air, and with a roar that set the high spires jangling, froze to death. He had become ice. He had crystallized. It does not matter what words I use to describe it, for there he was, and there he will be forever, alone and beautiful in the wild polar waste. Alone in his cathedral, my lion of white ice. Last letter. I cannot remember very much about my journey back from him to where I am now, sitting in one of the roughest igloos I've ever made. I was too tired to make it properly, for I had little help from Jackson, who was walking in his sleep. It was a black night and bitterly cold, but I was all aglow inside with what I had seen, and moved in a kind of trance, my leg spikes striking the ice monotonously, mile after mile. There was a dirty red look in the sky, and I knew a tempest was on its way, so I had to find a sheltered place for my igloo if I could. And at last I found one, halfway down a gully, The one thing I'm anxious about now is that you really get this letter and give the facts to the Natural History Museum. If only my camera had not been swept up in the whirlwind, I might possibly have got a snap of him on his throne. But I don't know. Somehow, I didn't want to do anything except look and look and look. The Eskimo's stamp, which is on the envelope, gives you a slight idea of him and of his whiteness, but not of his size and importance. Well, nephew, I must end this letter. I didn't think I wanted to write it at first, but I'm glad I've persevered. Oh, pickle my blubber. But I feel quite a literary light. Maybe one day I'll turn up in England. In the meanwhile, there's everything in the world I enjoy all around me. The sledges, the kayaks, the seals and killer whales. Jackson has just come in through the igloo doorway. He looks a bit excited. Oh, blubber! How clumsy he is. Tripping over my leg spike again and spilling all the coffee over the page. Oh, blubber him. I am absolutely sick of Jackson. This page is disgusting by any standards. I've been out to see what he is so excited about. It was only a herd of reindeer fighting with wolves. As though I hadn't seen that sort of thing often enough without being disturbed. However, I think I could do with another wolf skin, as the one I've lined my bowler hat with is almost in shreds. So, I must sharpen my sword spike and then be off, nephew. So, goodbye. From your lost uncle.